Okay, and then part two would be, would the Federal Reserve Bank be abridging the treaty power of the Constitution by making deals with private or other central banks, other government entities? Now, that's probably going to be the hardball.
No, it's not, because we've thought about it, and I think the answer is no. And as much as I don't like the answer, I think that is the answer. I think if I interpret the question, is the Federal Reserve violating the Constitution by entering into private contracts with foreign nations?
I spent a lot of time last night reading the Federal Reserve Act, and I don't do lawyerese very well in the science part, but that was interesting. I was trying to...
It was, and the part that I keep coming back to is in the Federal Reserve Act, which says that the Federal Reserve has the right to buy anything it wants to. That's a paraphrase, that's a layman's interpretation, but effectively they have the right to purchase any assets that it wants to. People think that the Federal Reserve only buys debt. In fact, that's the reason they think that. That's typically what they've done for the last 70 years. They'll buy debt. This question came up, by the way, not in regards to overseas treaties, but in the bailouts of various states. I got an email one time saying, are you all going to bail out California? And I said, absolutely not. But then I remember having a meeting with Bernanke when I asked him, you know, after you take interest rates to zero, and after you announce quantitative easing, you know, infinity, what's the next plan? He goes, well, you know, we can add other assets to the balance sheet. And I didn't know what that meant in that sense. I know what that means in a corporate sense, but I don't know what it means when the chairman of the Federal Reserve says the Federal Reserve has the right to add whatever assets it wants to its balance sheet. So to go look at the act, they can buy anything. They can buy this table. They can buy this country club, and they can buy debt to the state of California.
But
and they can buy foreign currency.
Doesn't that infer that they could buy any treasury bills that the Egyptian government of any flavor sells?
Yes.
Okay. Do you see a problem? I mean, I see a problem with that. As far as the foreign policy and national
No, but that was your question. Your question was not that I see a problem with it. Your question was it constitutional?
Oh, well, my apologies to you.
Right.
My question now is, I see a tremendous problem.
I see a tremendous problem with it. Listen, you don't have to worry about Egypt. I'm more worried about California.
Well, they're closer, but...
Yeah, the Constitution, I think, I don't see the constitutional challenge to it. I don't see anything in the Constitution. I mean, if you assume the Federal Reserve Act is constitutional, and there may be people in this room who think that it's not, but I'm pretty fairly
There's arguments both sides, and it's went for a long time.
Right, but I actually think it's been determined that it is constitutional. So for the sake of the discussion, we have to assume that it is, okay? We may think that's the wrong decision. And there's nothing wrong with thinking constitutional decisions are wrong. If we didn't challenge Supreme Court rulings, we'd still have slavery. And black people would still be less than human. That's not right. You have to continue to challenge the Supreme Court decisions that you believe are wrong. But for sake of an intellectual discussion, we have to assume the Federal Reserve Act is constitutional. And if it is, then I think the Federal Reserve has the right to buy this stuff. Do I think, with that as a background, it's time to look at limiting the Federal Reserve's ability to buy various assets? Absolutely. In fact, I think it's probably an issue that not very many people have contemplated, because you have this history of the Federal Reserve pretty much behaving itself and only buying U.S. Treasury debts. Okay? They've gone up, they've gone down, but they haven't gone out and bought that table. And not that many people know that they can buy that table. And now the simple fact that we are having a discussion, or starting to have a discussion about whether or not we'll have to bail out Illinois, Michigan, and California. And it's now come to light that even if the legislature says no, the Federal Reserve, which is truly independent and not at all accountable, can say yes and bail out California. That is a problem. And that's one of the things I think we need to look at. I used to think that the most important thing that we could do for the Federal Reserve was to get rid of the second half of the dual mandate.
Yeah.
To get rid of the full employment half of the dual mandate and let them just focus on prices, which monetary policy can impact. In fact, Bernanke will tell you himself that monetary policy cannot impact employment in the long run. It's a meaningless second. And by the way, that's Keynesian orthodoxy. All Keynesians think that. I used to think that getting rid of the full employment thing was the most important thing. Now, with California, Illinois, Michigan being where they are, I'm not wondering if limiting what tools the Federal Reserve has, specifically state debt, might be something we should look at right away.
I understand. I was amused to find that the Federal Reserve Police Force, and this probably should be question number 3, does come before me.
Yeah.
Since September 11th has now been nationalized. It it was a private police force because it was a private bank.
Yep.
And it was nationalized in December of 2001. So as a really tough question, I don't mind if you want to defer on this. Many governments have nationalized their central bank. Would that be a good idea or a bad idea? I hear from economists that that's, here in the U.S. that's a very bad idea, but I hear from economists across the pond at the Bundesbank that might be a good idea to nationalize.
Could I add one thing
Sure.
to that? I don't know if it was yesterday or early today in Europe, but the head of the European Bank wants to take off because some of the countries in Europe are having problems. They said, well, why don't we just all throw our budgets and everything in one big pile and then share it together, you know, like a church social.
That's not going to happen.
And of course, Merkel, her face was about that tall right there.
Yeah.
So saying, no.
The Treasury did a pretty good job 1870 to 1912. We became the biggest industrial power in the world.
Yeah.
And since the Fed, the value of our currencies went down 95%. We buy our underwear from China now.
Yeah.
So I think that might be
I'm not going to defer on your question, but I'll give you arguments both sides, because I haven't thought about that much. Because I take your question to be, should we get rid of an independent Federal Reserve Bank?
well, private, I don't like that word independent. I like the word, should we get rid of, should we nationalize the Fed or bring the functions back to Treasury? I know there's arguments both sides. I get from the Treasury.
Right, I mean, the whole reason we got rid of that in the first place was to try and isolate it from political pressure.
So it wouldn't do moral hazard, so it wouldn't give you guys the keys to the credit card.
Correct.
But now we have New York City big banks that have the keys to the credit card.
And that's why, and you go back all the way, again, for sake of discussion, where do you start that debate? You start that debate is whether or not the Federal Reserve is constitutional, or at least well advised in the beginning. I don't. The Constitution clearly doesn't say, and we're going to have a Federal Reserve. You know, part of the difficulty, of course, is once you start moving to fiat paper currency, how are you going to handle it? You can have another discussion about whether or not you go back on the gold standard. So you've got an onion here with a lot of different pieces to it. So I guess to the extent I'm deferring, I'll defer on what I think about, because I haven't really thought about whether or not we'd be better off getting rid of it. Let's talk about something we did do this year, which is we passed the Audit the Fed bill, which I co-sponsored and voted for. Some of what you've heard, by the way, this is where that email page is interesting, that on the website, what you heard is not true. How many people think that the Federal Reserve is not audited? Not audited.
By GAO standards.
It's, I think it's one of the big four firms.
Hopefully it isn't Arthur Anderson.
Yeah, well, they're audited. They're not audited to exactly the same standards as corporate America is, but they are audited by an outside body on a regular basis. I still supported the bill and will continue to support the bill simply because I think that, to your original point, is it should be private, should be less independent. I think that you're talking now about a situation where people don't realize this. The Federal Reserve is actually owned by the merchant banks. That when you have that type of institution that has that much power, y'all expect me to be able to at least keep an eye on it, more than just reading the FOMC minutes, 30 days after it takes place. And I think it's incumbent upon us. The more the Federal Reserve wanted to be quiet, simply sit in its corner and watch inflation and make sure there wasn't too much inflation, there wasn't any deflation, then I don't have that much concern with it. When it starts talking now about $40 billion a month in mortgage-backed security purchases, when it talks about doing these foreign currency swaps, where effectively we're lending money to Europe, then I think that invites more oversight, and I think you have to have it. That said, there has to be a fine line there, because if you're going to have an independent Fed, do you want to be able to ask the Federal Reserve, to haul the Federal Reserve into Congress the same way you would Eric Holder? Some people would say yes, and some people would say no, not at all. And then I wonder if there isn't some balance between the two, where you can have some oversight, but you cannot haul the guy over the rock like you do with Holder, and rightly so. I mean, what we've done to Holder is we haven't even begun to deal with him yet. So I don't know if the Federal Reserve is its own thing and should be treated the same as every other agency, or differently than every other agency, or some type of blend of the two. I keep coming back to this thing though about the assets that it can buy, because essentially what we've done is given it carte blanche to do whatever it wants. And I don't know if that was ever the intention. When they passed the Federal Reserve Act, I don't think they said, all right, what we want the Federal Reserve to be able to do is bail out a state that's gone broke, even though the national legislature doesn't want you to do that. That would make the Federal Reserve superior to the national legislature. And I don't think that anybody would make the argument that was ever the intent.
And I think that's what it's become. Is I hear this independent bank all the time, but what has been for years has been supernatural,
I think that's
international bank. And I think that's in violation of the spirit of the Federal Reserve Bank.
Bill?
I get, maybe I'm just a simple person, but how do you have a Federal Reserve Act created by the government, and then it become totally independent and not answerable to the government that created it?
Good question. No, it's a good question.
I'm just simple.
And you're not wrong, because on its face, I asked the same thing. I'm sitting there, wait a second, because the question actually came up with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is now the second independent agency, set up very similar to the Fed, funded actually the same way that the Fed is. No, this is it part of Dodd-Frank? It is, yeah, okay. It's either CFPB. And my question was, what if we don't like that? IPAB, the same way, the Independent Payment Advisory Board, no oversight from Congress. So how does Congress set up something that has no oversight over it? It can still get rid of it. That power still exists. We could repeal the Federal Reserve Act, we could repeal Obamacare, you could repeal the IPAB part of it, you could repeal Dodd-Frank. So the ultimate oversight still exists. The death, you could still give the death penalty, but as long as it exists, these entities are going to exercise an unparalleled level of independence.
Congressman, I know we got